Welcome everyone to the PSA Annual Lecture 2020, where we're ready to begin the event now with a welcome address from Hugh Edwards.
Thank you very much, and can I extend a very warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening. We have, I'm told now, over 1,000 people registered. Not all of them joining us quite yet, but they're joining us as we speak. And that's no surprise, really, given the speaker that we have and her caliber and status and the subject. So thank you all for supporting the event. I'm joining you from the heart of the BBC News Machine in central London. It's a very busy day here, as you can imagine, with the Chancellor's rather sobering autumn statement. The news just a few hours ago of the death of Diego Maradona. Big debate here about, was he the best footballer of all time or one of the best? That's one of the debates we're having today. And of course, we're keeping an eye on the appointments made by President-elect Biden now that the transition is finally underway, and looking at how those appointments will affect decisions being made by Boris Johnson's government. Now, I'm delighted to be playing just a small part in this event. It's the 70th anniversary of the Political Studies Association, the UK's leading learned society, promoting and supporting the teaching and the study of politics. It's an excellent organisation. If you're not following it on Twitter and goodness knows where else, I suggest you do. It's a really good and rich source of knowledge and expertise. And that area of study, I think, is never more needed than it is today. We've had several years of turbulent politics. People are finding it difficult to make sense of lots of that. And they've raised questions really about the way that our democratic functions work, the way that politics is reported by various branches of the media, including my own here. Some of the questions, yes, I will admit this, can be quite uncomfortable, but they are valid and they deserve attention. Other questions, I'm sorry to say, seem to be fueled by all kinds of crazy and zany theories, which will further damage trust in the process. And that's not a problem exclusive to the UK. As we know, it's a problem being seen in other democracies too. What we can say with delight and relief, and I'm happy to say this, not in a party political sense, of course not, my dear friends, but that the age of experts is back. There was a time where apparently people had had enough of experts. Well, experts are back. They're making vaccines, for example. They're saving lives. They are giving us all kinds of expertise and knowledge in order to make very important decisions. And in order to understand where we are in this tricky political landscape, of course, we need experts and we need expertise. We want to be challenged. We want to take on different views. We want to weigh up the evidence. That's how it should work. That's how a healthy society works. It's how a healthy democracy works. It is open to new ideas. It is happy to be challenged. Consuming media content, if I may say this before we introduce our distinguished speaker, consuming media content which simply reinforces your own prejudice is not a particularly healthy thing to do. That may be an unpopular thing to say and an unfashionable thing to say, but it's really a deeply corrosive thing, and we've got to move away from it. We see it in lots of countries, and we see it right now, of course, as millions of Americans are still questioning the validity of the presidential outcome, despite the fact that there are officials across the United States, Democrats and Republicans, who have full faith in the system that has been playing out in recent weeks. So what do we have in this bracket of expertise? We have an acknowledged expert and leader in her field, standing by to share her expertise with us. Before I introduce Pippa, a quick reminder that you can submit questions. Of course you can, by using the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, okay? The chat feature is to chat among yourselves, but the Q&A feature, which we will then monitor in order to put questions to Pippa at the end of the session. So, what can I say about Professor Pippa Norris? She is the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She's also the founding director of the Electoral Integrity Project. She is someone of worldwide academic renown, and we are delighted to have her with us, rightly known for her rigor in analysis and for all the intellectual firepower that she brings to her work. So Pippa, a very warm welcome to you. It's a very timely invitation, I have to say. I'm going to hand over to you, and then with your permission, we will put a few questions to you at the end. Thank you very much.
So what we're going to do is really think about the US election in a broader context. And we're thinking about the outcome, we're thinking about the transition crisis, and we want to think about what the implications are for American democracy. And you can contact me through any of these means, and you can download the slides through this link. And I'm going to also talk about this and give you the link at the end. So the PSA, just to start, one reason I was so pleased with the introduction and by the welcome that you've had is that PSA has always seemed to be my home for many, many years. It was where I started my career. It was founded, of course, with IPSA in 1949, 70 years. I'm not quite 70, but when I came along with my early career, the PSA was always there. It was my network. It was where I found contacts, intellectual stimulation, where I joined the Women in Politics group, where I helped to create the Elections, Parties and Public Opinion group. And I really congratulate the PSA for everything which it's done over the years and hope that everybody has great success in future years as well. So what I'm going to do is start with a theory. When we're thinking about the election, we can let our passions overrule our brain. We can think about it in terms of punditry. And indeed, some scholars have come out with all sorts of op-ed, which is a little bit inadvisable, talking about coups, talking about violence and so on. But let's think about the theory of what we know about when elections work, when they fail. Then think about the context of the transition crisis and a little bit about American elections in general. We're going to think about how they've worked and what the actual results look like. And then what I'm going to focus on is 6 potential risks which this current crisis, the lack of a secession, might have created. And then what's the conclusions and the impacts. So what's the theory that we can draw upon? And I think that when we're trying to understand this current crisis, we've got 4 different literatures, which give us a broad framework where we know from our evidence in the past what's happened in other countries, and where we can put America, therefore, in a broader context. So democratic backsliding, a new literature which has really been developing for the last decade. And that's work, for example, by Steve Levitsky and Daniel Zimblad. It's work by Larry Diamond. It's work by, if we go back, Sam Huntington. But we also have to look at the newer literature on electoral integrity. And again, this is nothing new. Many countries around the world have problems with their elections, lacking legitimacy, sometimes ending up in violence. So we need to think about that. We can build on the newer work on authoritarian populism. My own book with Inglehart, but other broad interests about the role of Trump. Is he a threat to democracy? Or is populism some sort of opportunity to expand the electorate and those who are included? And we can also think obviously about American politics for this case and think what we know about Congress, what happened under Obama, how elections work in the institutions in America. So this is just some of the literature that everybody's been producing on the crisis of democracy, democratic backsliding, work from legal scholars, work from comparativists, work from institutionalists, and of course, obviously not just in America, we can think about work being done in Germany, work which is relevant for the United Kingdom. But more precisely, I'm going to draw on some of the work I've been doing over the years. And I started the Electoral Integrity Project in 2012, well before Trump came down the golden escalator and we worried about America. And I started by saying, why does it matter? And then I went on to what are the causes, why elections fail in so many parts of the world. And then how do we strengthen electoral integrity? So I'm going to draw on that framework and then essentially use the American elections as a case study of what we might expect. So why does electoral integrity matter? Well, we can start with Joseph Schumpeter, which is very familiar to all political scientists, a minimalist concept of elections at the heart of democracy. And so here, democracy is about choosing representatives through competitive elections to carry out their will. And of course, it's not just Schumpeter, it's Tversky and others who have taken up that idea. So elections are at the heart of most ideas of democracy. And legitimacy is about whether or not you believe that the regime works, that things are effective, and that you should obey the law, that you should have particular leaders who are authoritative. And in Simon Martin Lipset's classic definition, it's the capacity for regimes, for countries and for governments to engender the belief that the institutions we have, parliamentary institutions, presidential executives, ways in which the federal system should work are the most appropriate and proper ones for society. So obviously you can govern through many mechanisms. You've got coercion, you've got clientelism and corruption, but legitimacy says, okay, the people who get elected are the authorities. They're the ones that we should basically recognize, and therefore we should go along during their term of office. So if elections go wrong, if there are questions, if people don't believe in elections, then there might be three consequences which matter for democracy and for legitimacy. Number one, there could be attitudinal effects in our culture. So we've all know about declining trust. It's been a long-standing theme. Some declining trust, I argue, can be fine, but too much can obviously be corrosive. So what we might find is that if everybody believes that the American election was unfair, fraudulent, stolen, rigged, all the words which Trump uses, then that might mean that we no longer feel that Biden is the legitimate president, or that we can trust our processes to actually vote in the next election. There might be consequences for our behavior. And again, my book on why electoral integrity matters says it depresses voting turnout in many countries. Why should people vote if they don't think elections work? And it might encourage protests, which can spill over into violence in countries which are not well established or have institutions which are not yet essentially consolidated. And the institutions might mean that the challenges rock or weaken regime stability. Now, all of that has been laid out in my book as a kind of model where we think about the quality of elections and democracy. And then we think about how public perceives electoral integrity or malpractices. That you might predict leads to feelings of political legitimacy, although it's not the only criteria. Obviously, there are many others go into legitimacy. That in turn leads to the behavioral consequences. And then how the regime responds. For example, do they bring in reforms? And there are all sorts of reforms on the table to get over the problems of American elections, like strengthening voting rights. Do we have in other countries state repression or even regime change? And then that goes back to the next set of elections. So that's the theory. How does that give us some insights into the risks? And the risks particularly of the US transition crisis that we've all been following on our Twitter feed and through our media and through the BBC News as well. So the first risks, I'd argue, are to the transition, and that's about governance, public administration 101. Can Biden appoint his staff? Does he have his funds? Secondly, risks to America's image abroad and how far America can stand up for democracy and human rights when they're violated if they are seen as real weaknesses at home. Policy failure and DC gridlock, not a new topic, a basic problem in American politics, particularly with divided government, but that might be exacerbated. Fourthly, it might deepen party polarization, particularly the differences with the Republican Party, which has moved much more in terms of both authoritarianism in its ideas, and I'd argue in challenging liberal democracy, and then a legitimacy crisis in the electorate, and the worst crisis, of course, a Trump coup. Now, we can assess these and debate these, and these are somewhat speculative because we don't know what's going to happen in the next few years. We don't even know what's going to happen in the run-up to the inauguration. But we can use our best information and some current evidence and what's happened in other countries to try to assess these risks. So let's first just mention the context. Now, I'm sure that many of you have been looking at the results incessantly, basically, from election night on the 3rd as the states came in. We know what the results are now. Clearly, a substantial electoral college win for Joseph Biden, 306, 80 million votes, and Donald Trump, and these are the updated figures as we've had certification come in, 74 million votes, substantial number of Americans still support him, but 232. And of course, if we look at the states, the big difference is the blue wall, which has come back, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the old Rust Belts, along with some gains, Arizona, increasingly a population that's changing, and we can see that the West has always been solidly Democratic and they've made sufficient gains. And then obviously Georgia is critical, hasn't been won since Clinton, and an important beachhead for the solid South, and whether or not the Democrats can regain competitiveness. Florida, they hoped for, they didn't get, obviously. But if you look at the map in 2020 and in 2016, it looks very familiar with those exceptions of the states which switched. What does this look like if we just look at the popular vote share? Was it a decisive result? Well, the thing is that most elections in recent years have come about with very tight outcomes. It was 51 to 47. So it wasn't enormous, 6 million votes, but still a fairly small swing. If you look at where Hillary Clinton was and where Joe Biden was, not that great, 3 points. If you look where Trump was, the same. So what's changed is essentially, it was very similar to the result of Obama-Romney in 2012 as a proportion of the popular vote and 2008. So you can say the Democrats have kind of come home. But the important point also is it wasn't clearly the landslides that used to be there in the period, essentially in the 60s to the 2000s. There you had enormous switches. Think about Johnson, think about Nixon, think about some of the Reagan landslides. So that leads to more contentious outcomes in any close election. In the Electoral College, it was actually, of course, a repeat of Trump, 306, a comfortable 74 Electoral College votes. But if a few close contests in some counties and some states had just tipped the other way, as we thought when the initial results were called, that could have changed the outcome. And it wasn't back to where Obama was in 2008 and 12. So it's a victory, it's a solid victory. It's well over the 217, but it's still not quite back in Electoral College votes. And I won't go into the votes and seats and where people switched, like the exit polls and so on. I'm happy to talk about that, but let's move on to the other issues of the transition. Where do we go from here? Well, normally a transition is overnight. The next day or that night, Americans are used to people, the networks and the Associated Press calling the election, as has been done ever since 1848. Polling day, the 3rd of November. 7th of November was when we had to find the actual result, when the Press Association projected the winner. They didn't certify it, they didn't call it, but they projected that there, according to Pennsylvania in particular, that came in late, that was a clear victory for Joe Biden. The 23rd of November, however, 3 weeks later, from the actual polling day, was the first time that the transition was officially acknowledged by the General Services Administration, which was the beginning of bringing funds to Biden, allowing him to appoint staff and so on. So a considerable delay and all sorts of issues going on in between. 8th of December is when we're going to have vote certification. That's the deadline. The Electoral College, a very obscure body that nobody normally knows about. Suddenly everybody's an electoral expert and an electoral and constitutional expert. The Electoral College meets. That's when the president is actually officially moving from president-elect to the official anointment. And then we have, of course, 20th of January, inauguration, patriotic music, balloons, a different type of inauguration in the pandemic, but still a big celebration. And we assume that, of course, Donald Trump will leave the White House and that President Biden will move in. Not quite the election night in Britain where the moving van comes behind number 10 that day or the next day, but still the transition. So this is what happened on the 8th or the 7th or the 8th, the announced results after Pennsylvania. But there were immediately massive celebrations, street parties, quite remarkable how many people turned out, a wonderful sense of relief, which came through and swept through those who'd supported the Democrats, 80 million voters, of course, but also, of course, pushback, strong amongst Donald Trump supporters, amongst the MAGA movement. And as we've seen from this photo, this is of the Proud Boys, also protests amongst radical groups, extremists who are white supremacists, who threatened violence, who came armed in their demonstrations. So there has been demonstrations and then counter demonstrations. And of course, the context for the transition, Donald Trump's tweets. Over 500, the New York Times reckons, since the election. I mean, he's been golfing and tweeting. That seems to be, oh, and pardoning a turkey, that seems to be his main activities. 3/4 of his tweets have sought to undermine the integrity. Look at those trends. 30 tweets sometimes on some days about challenges to electoral integrity. And you've seen them all if you follow Twitter. We also won the, this is just the last couple of days, some of them I just selected. And by the way, of course, Twitter is putting these little messages on, but the messages are so polite, I'm not sure they actually hit the mark. Great, but we also won the election, he said 2 days ago. Multiple sources call this election differently, Twitter says. How do you lose a case when large numbers of voters are disenfranchised, voters are thrown out of counting rooms, there's been fake ballots, etc. This claim about electoral fraud is disputed, and so on and so forth. Signatures, details, most people don't follow these details at all, but they do see the constant criticisms. His followers are enormous on Twitter. And of course, it's not just Twitter, they're amplified. Fox has had mixed signals, but now new networks have taken over some of their role, and people have even moved from Twitter to Parler who support the president. Expert evidence says there is no validity to these claims. This is just a snapshot of some of the evidence I've collected from a new survey of over 800 American political scientists after the election. And I asked them over 50 questions about electoral integrity, and these are just some of the questions about fraud. And I asked them, do you agree or disagree in your state? When you looked at the election, when you experienced the election, were votes counted fairly? Were they conducted in accordance with the law, et cetera, et cetera? You can see that 8 out of 10, 80% plus, agreed that all of these things were not accurate criticisms. Some said don't know, quite rightly, because they're technical issues. There were a few who said, yes, these are problems. But again, it's nothing like the fraud. And the court cases have been failing. 3 dozen or so have gone through and been tossed by the courts and by judges. The media has overwhelmingly come out to criticize the fraud accusations, and even Donald Trump's friends and allies are now starting to withdraw from that. So what are the risks? So far, Donald Trump has not conceded, which is the convention. He breaks the soft norms on that. But what are the broader risks to American democracy and to the transition crisis? And what we've got to do, I think, as a community is really judge these and use our best evidence to assess them, not just to be pundits, but to think, what do we already know about party polarization? What do we already know about gridlock? What do we already know about legitimacy? So the first risks, here's a scenario. Clearly, there were delays, substantial 3 weeks from polling, the close of polls, to the beginning of the official transition, which meant that Biden could not make some key staff appointments. He didn't have the funds which are allocated. He didn't have access to government agencies. He didn't have intelligence briefings. And particularly, we're going through a tremendous pandemic, just like Britain. And the results are dreadful if you look at the projections, especially most recently with the 3rd wave that we've had, worsening pandemics, and vaccine needs to be rolled out. A tremendous task. So all of that, you could argue, has been delayed. But against that, we know that President-elect Biden, has basically had a very calm demeanor. He hasn't been tweeting that much. He says basically unity, that's about it. But he's an experienced leader. He inherits a very seasoned team. It's only been 4 years since the Obama team left the White House. He does have some funds for staffing from other mechanisms. And anyway, the governors are responsible for COVID. So in general, I think I can conclude that the short delay is a problem, but it hasn't been critical. And successive court battles have failed. And of course, now we've just known 2 days ago that the General Services Administration said, okay, go ahead formally with the transition. The legal cases for the administrator of the General Services Administration said, okay, they've all gone against the Trump claims. So the actual winner will be predicted by the Electoral College, but still we can go ahead with public services. And of course, appointments have gone ahead. As Hugh mentioned earlier, we've got a range of appointments, seasoned people, some fresh faces for the public, some not. John Kerry for as climate czar, Janet Yellen moving to Treasury, Avril Haines, National Intelligence, the first woman, Linda Thomas Greenfield restoring some relationships with the United Nations, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, a long-standing aide. People have been around the block. Somebody said on Twitter, it's very welcome to have, for a change, competence. People who are seasoned veterans, people with experience of how to get stuff done. And that, I think, is very much the Biden mode. He has been criticized by some for that, but I think there is a wealth of talent that he can call upon. He doesn't have to go to the Senate to pull out people which would create problems. He might look at governors, he might look at the House. We'll see how things play out. So the second risk, damages to America's soft power. This is about diplomacy, and it's about democracy around the world, which I care passionately about. The fact that American elections were seen as so poor, the fact that a president can essentially contest the results using soft pressures means that the power of example, as Biden puts it, is damaged. And this weakens the ability of America to stand up when there are major crises. Think about Belarus, with massive demonstrations to challenge those elections. Hong Kong, with pressures to push back on the Communist Party's repression. Hungary, with the challenges right now. So all of those mean that the forces of democracy and the ways in which US aid used to support those and technical assistance have been weakened. Now, against that, we have to say, okay, but let's take a grip. It might just be that people criticize this as a temporary setback. It was Trump, not America. But it might be that there has been long-standing damage as well. Biden has immediately promised with his new team to repair multilateral relations. We're going to go back to Paris. We're going to go back to the World Health Organization. And essentially, a lot of that was done by executive order can be reversed. So it might be that the damage isn't so great. But again, look at this. This is from Pew. And they do excellent work when they've monitored how other countries see America. Are they favorable or not? And these are averages amongst public opinion. And you can look at the United Kingdom. In 2000, 83% had approval and favorable views of the United States. It's halved. But it's even worse in France, 31%. In Germany, it's gone down, plummeted from about 3/4 to 1/4 now approve when we look at the recent figures in 2020. And you can see Canada, I mean, you know, the closest ally to the United States, forgive me, Britain, but they are, 35% have a favorable view of the United States. So what goes down can go up, of course, but it doesn't look immediately promising. Okay, the third risks. So this is about gridlock. And we know that under Obama, wherever there's divided government, there have been fundamental problems, whether it's appointments or whether it's legislation. And so much now goes through executive orders, which are one way of doing things, but they're not accountable in the way that legislation is. And what this transition crisis signals is it's not simply Trump, it is at least the Republican Party and the senior leadership in Congress, because McConnell has still not acknowledged that Biden is the legitimate winner. McConnell has said things should go through the courts and then maybe. And what it does is it signals that the new Senate, if it continues to be dominated by the Republicans, and that depends on Georgia, but it looks quite likely they'll hold on to it. The House has lost some moderate Democrats. So it looks like there will not be necessarily clear cooperation in any shape or form with the Biden agenda. Biden has said already that what he wants to do is essentially have 4 priorities: deal with the pandemic, economic recovery, climate change, and racial justice. And of course, there's a long list of other things which Democrats want to do. And America is facing an urgent crisis, just like Britain, everywhere around the world with the pandemic, which is so bad. The courts are going to be stacked with more conservative judges. So even if there's an executive order, it might not get through. Even if there was law that got through, it might not be accepted. And yet again, there are some grounds that we don't have to be totally pessimistic. We know again that there's nobody more experienced than Biden and his team in working with Congress, in getting cooperation. He's given us an olive branch. And there might be common grounds on several issues that would allow issues to be compromised on infrastructure, on CARES 2, replacing the initial measures that were done to help, for example, the hospitality industry, and then DACA for many 11 million who are currently illegal immigrants. So we'll have to see. And I'm going through these risks, and I'm now heading towards the more serious or fundamental risks, I think, to American democracy. So this is where things get even more pessimistic in my view. We know that there's long-term party polarization, and I'm going to document a bit of that. In particular, what happens is that where you get parties moving apart, where you get the rise of authoritarian populists, but you have proportional elections, where you have all parties able to get some people into parliament, some representatives, and maybe some ministers into government, then that's one thing. But if you get party polarization under winner take all, this of course was the situation with Brexit, a very close vote between the divisions of those who wanted to leave and remain. And it was a winner take all, the Brexit means Brexit statement. And the whole majoritarian basis of the electoral rules, you win or you lose. And of course, in America, you win the presidency or you lose. And you win through the electoral college or you lose. So that reinforces a sense that if your basic support is declining, as I believe that the demographics are against the Republican Party, you're going to have problems in actually achieving any success at presidential level. You can still take the Senate, partly because of rural overrepresentation. And indeed, the Electoral College actually benefits you again because it has a greater weight to rural states, which tend to be more Republican. But where the parties have moved apart, then you're going to be able to have real difficulties in getting any sort of unanimity in the moderate center. And remember, more moderates have been leaving the Republican Party. They were either defeated or they resigned because they could not work under Trump. And there is evidence of widening divisions. And these aren't just over left-right, the sort of divisions over market versus state that you had under Reagan. They are there, low taxes versus public spending. But we've had growing cleavages, which I've argued in my book with Inglehart, on the liberal conservative social values, on the issues. We've always had issues of abortion and gun control that are kind of one issue policies which divide Americans, but increasingly other issues, whether it's about gender equality, whether it's about LGBTQ rights, whether it's issues about religion, whether it's issues about fundamental positions between belonging to the world through multilateralism or putting America first through nationalism. And of course, the issues of race and immigration, which have deepened, building the wall, and those other claims that Trump has made exemplify that. But even so, I think the divisions in American politics aren't just about the economy, and they're not just about culture. They're also about the democratic rules of the game. And that's where it gets dangerous. If you don't agree on the umpire, if you don't agree how fair the election is, then how can you actually work as a democracy? If you don't believe in bargaining and compromise and the usual stuff of, you know, I'll do something for you if you do something for me through the legislative brokering process. And my emphasis is it's not simply Trump. Trump can leave the stage, perhaps temporarily, we'll have to see, but it's about the Republican Party commitment to democratic norms. And this started to erode, not just under Trump in 2016, but earlier than that. Let me give you a little bit of evidence. I'll give you it from my new survey, the Global Party Survey, which is available to download, and from V-Party, which has just come out from the Varieties of Democracy project in Sweden. This is from my study. And what this does is it asks experts, many of you may hopefully have participated, about positions of parties in their own country. And this is about two basic divisions. One is about where do you place them on the left or the right on the economy? And I give a little explanation below. It's about issues of taxes, welfare states, and so on. And then on the vertical axis, where do you place the parties on social values? Are they liberal or are they conservative? For example, on abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and democratic participation. And as you can see, we've got clusters of parties, and the US Democrats I've highlighted in the lower quadrant. And by the way, they're also pluralist, not populist, according to my data. And they're there with many other Labour parties, social democratic parties, parties which are essentially middle of the road, centre left in New Zealand, in Spain, in Britain, in the Netherlands, and so on. You can see, by the way, that the Labour Party under Corbyn, when this was taken, was more to the left, but nevertheless, they're all liberal left progressive types. If you look up in the far right quadrant, however, the authoritarian conservatives, that's where we place now, that's where the experts place now the Republicans. And so where are they? They're close to Vox in Spain, the Swiss People's Party that's been in government as an authoritarian populist party for many years, but also the Alternative for Germany, which has been very successful as a rival to Angela Merkel, Likud in Israel, and a whole bunch of other parties which are more radical, particularly more conservative and more right-wing. But that's not the most dangerous cleavage. This is the most dangerous cleavage. And I also asked our experts in the same survey, does the party favour checks and balances on the executive, or do they prefer to have fewer checks? And Do they respect liberal democratic principles, values and norms, or do they undermine them? And again, the US Democrats down here in the center of basically most of the major left-wing progressive parties and many other parties as well, in Norway, in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in Germany, Green parties, Liberal parties, Labour parties, whereas the US GOP right up. And if you look at what are their neighbours, the Greek Golden Dawn, a party which has been declared a fascist party, which has been outlawed through using violence in Greece, Hungary, Fidesz, and many others, again, the German Alternative for Germany, and parties which we can see, such as the Polish Law and Justice, currently a very authoritarian populist party in Poland right now. So the gap, as you can see, on the basic rules of the game is enormous. And it's not just that this is new. Here we have some evidence from V Party, a brand new study. Now, whether or not it's valid, we have to question. We haven't yet tested it because it's brand new. The number of experts in it is limited, but I just pulled out some of the results from that, from trends over time. And they look at it from 1970 to 2018. And the blue line is obviously Democrats, the red line is Republicans. I do apologize to our Brits because it's always confusing when you think what is red and what is blue, but this is the American convention. And here's the question: to what extent are they strongly committed to democratic norms prior to elections? And the important point is that the Republican Party started to change, according to these evidence, in the late 90s, 2000. It increased in 2010. Remember, that was partly the Tea Party came around and the party started to shift in its values in Congress. And it's accelerated under Trump and then plateaued. The Democratic Party doesn't change, according to this evidence. So what's happened is that the gap has expanded and that Trump has accelerated this challenge to democratic norms, but he's not necessarily responsible. It's something in the Republican Party. The same is true in some other indicators in V Party. For example, is the party committed to free and fair elections with multiple checks and balances, parties, freedom of speech, etc., liberalism, basically, not just democracy. And again, here what we can see is whether or not they're committed to liberalism, and the Democratic Party stays flat. The Republicans go down in the mid 1980s, according to this evidence. They plummet in 2000. That was partly Bush v. Gore. They recover somewhat, but there were some other issues. And then 2010, they go downwards, just like they did in the previous slide. So the last two risks, a legitimacy crisis. We're always talking about a legitimacy crisis. In fact, we sometimes exaggerate it. But does the rhetoric of both the Trump administration and his allies and the court cases erode confidence in elections? Does it lead to broader losses of trust in how democracy works? And there is some evidence. I'll just show you a bit of it. I go through it mostly in my book, Why Electoral Integrity Matters. And this gives you more details based on a comparative data, but let's look at some American evidence. Here's whether or not Americans believe that democracy is the best form of government. Now, you might have assumed that it was overwhelming support, given the history, given centuries of democracy in America. In the early 90s, in the mid 90s, when the World Values Survey started to report this, it was overwhelming support, 90%. It plummets and goes down until 2011, and then goes up slightly. So when people are asked, this is the proportion of Americans saying it's very good or fairly good, and it goes down from 90% to around 80%. But here's an even more worrying indicator. The same World Values Survey has always asked about support for strongman leaders, a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections. In the mid-90s, a quarter of Americans agreed with that. It goes up. It goes up in every successive wave. It goes up to a third, and it goes up in 2017. And this is before 2020. In America, almost 40% say they don't want to bother with Congress and elections. And by the way, this isn't just America. This is a global phenomenon. If you look at cases like South Africa, Again, blue is the support for democracy, red is the support for strong leaders without elections. South Africa, South Korea, Montenegro, Argentina, Peru, Azerbaijan, Taiwan, Romania, lots of countries. It does appear that in each decade, when I look at my World Values Survey, support for strongman leaders has gone up. Confidence in American elections goes down. It was about half the American public, goes down to a third, some recovery, but we'll have to see what happens in 2020. And here's the last slides on the legitimacy crisis. These are some polls that were done by various organizations after the election. And they asked people, for example, do you think mail ballots are being manipulated to favor Joe Biden? Remember that barrage of Twitter feeds, remember the criticisms on the One News Network, on Fox News, in the commentary and the conspiracy theories. 90% said yes, ballots are being manipulated if you voted for Trump. 90% of Biden voters said no. Do you think illegal immigrants voted fraudulently? Now, this does not refer to Biden, so you're not queuing respondents. 88% of Trump voters said, yep, that sounds about right to me. Definitely or probably true. Do you think that enough fraud occurred that it actually determined or influenced the outcome? 8 out of 10 Trump voters said, yep, that happened for sure. And so we end up with the legitimacy crisis on both sides. The T-shirt, "Not My President," being very popular under the Trump period, and the MAGA, "Stop the Steal" protests. And remember, of course, the millions of votes which Donald Trump received, and Joe Biden will never be my president. If that persists, that's a real crisis for American democracy. The last risk, is there a risk of a soft coup? Well, unfortunately, some scholars did rush into print and said, yes, this is going to happen in their op-eds, always dangerous to do. And of course, I think this has really been overturned by the developments in the last few days. Clearly, the president hasn't yet conceded, but the lawsuits are continuing, but they fail. And as we know, many indicators suggest that the tide has turned. The safeguards have worked. The courts have thrown out these lawsuits as having no evidence. There have been mainly peaceful protests with a few incidents. GSA has approved the transition. The federal and state officials, even Republicans, for example, secretaries of state, like in Georgia, have pushed back and said, no, 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 we're not going to go along with these claims. The elections worked well. And gradually more Republican leaders are acknowledging Biden's victory. So we're not out of the woods. Donald Trump is still in the White House, but we're going that way. So what's the overall conclusion? Of these risks, I'd argue that the transition government, that's a more minor issue, I'd argue. Soft power may recover along with America's image. The policy failures are likely to persist under a Biden administration if the GOP retains the Senate. Deepening party polarization is very worrying when you don't agree about democracy, when you don't agree about voting rights, when you don't agree about the Electoral College, and when you can't reform the system as a result. There is a legitimacy crisis in the electorate because so many people believe that there was fraud. Whether that persists, time will tell, as we always say. A coup, not so much. At least we can all sleep at night and not worry quite so much about that particular problem. And the problems go right back to our theory. Lintz and Stefan says, there are problems for democratic breakdown if some major actors refuse to observe democratic norms, and if it's not just Trump, but also the Republican Party and the Republican leadership in Congress, if the overwhelming majority of people no longer believe in democracy, and if some significant groups, such as white supremacists, such as domestic terrorists, which have now been reported just yesterday to really reaching record levels in America, go up, and if they obviously seek to overturn and threaten the Trump administration. And there have been physical threats clearly against the Michigan governor, but whether or not that occurs more generally is an issue. So let's end up on a more cheerful note. There are threats, but you know, in this mock-up as rather a joke, The New York Times on the 20th, we hope, will say Biden's inaugurated. And tomorrow we can be thankful. It is Thanksgiving. Trump pardoned the turkey, called corn, not cob. And there are some norms which go on. Trump has tried to break the norms. The Republican Party seems to have become infected by these ideas, but he actually was both a cause and a consequence. He was a consequence of these changes, and he accelerated these changes. What's the future? Time will tell. And again, if you want to download the slides for your own classes, for teaching, for any other purposes, to look at it in more depth, you're welcome to do so. I really welcome your thoughts and criticisms and ideas. And Hugh, back to you, and we'll come back and think about what all of these things mean.
Pippa, I think I can say very confidently, judging by the comments, that everyone enjoyed that. You packed an enormous amount in and did it incredibly concisely, for which we are grateful. And in fact, judging by the questions, and there are over 40 that I've taken so far, so don't be terrified, I'm going to whittle them down a little bit. They do touch on all of the main points that you raised. Lots of people, by the way, commending the clarity of the talk, which they welcomed, and the fact that you had lots of dense data, which you went through in an exemplary way to just underline the points you're making. So many thanks for what was a splendid talk. We all appreciate it. Judging by the chat room, which I had a quick glimpse into, it looked fairly spicy at one point, so I quickly dipped out of it immediately. So thank you for keeping the questions little, interesting, but maybe a little less spicy, where people were debating legitimacy of elections, and clearly Pippa had very strong views on it. You'll be not surprised to learn. So I'm going to try to group these questions, if I may, and for all of you who sent in questions, I'm saying thank you very much. I'm going to try and group them. Can I group them in this kind of way, Pippa, if you can? Lots of questions there about the prospects of institutional reform. Now, the question comes up in different ways, but you talked about the Electoral College, you talked about the various structures in the electoral process, and the fact that, you've noted what are clearly weaknesses in some of them and glaring errors in others. What are the prospects for major institutional reform, given the repeated difficulties that we see?
So this is a really good issue, Hugh, and obviously there's a big agenda. And in fact, Biden had an agenda on democratic reforms, which he put into his campaign. And so the Electoral College could be reformed. There is a movement amongst states to go towards a division which is proportional, not a winner take all for the whole state. But changing the Electoral College is going to be constitutional, which is a problem because you've got to get not only the Senate, where there's no majority, but also a substantial majority of all the different states. Electoral processes, of course, they could be reformed. There are so many things. I've worked for years, ever since I founded the project, to say, why isn't there an electoral management body like there is the UK Electoral Commission or Elections Canada? Why is it that every state and every locality sets the rules and they're set by partisan officials? So again, we can improve what you might electoral administration, right? We can improve voting rights and restore voting rights, particularly for minorities and communities of color. And that again is a primary focus for the Biden administration. And we can change things like reforming campaign funding. The FEC is broken. All sorts of dark funds are now available. And I've got a whole long list of institutional reforms. The problem is that you need a majority of both houses to get even some of this through by law, and to get it constitutionally through is difficult. So again, think back to 1997 and the Blair administration. A tremendous number of changes occurred in Britain, from devolution and the Scottish Parliament, through reform of the Lords, through Northern Ireland Assembly, etc., and changes to the electoral system for European elections. America can't do that. The comparative, if you want to look for some data, look at the Comparative Constitutions Project. It looks at every constitution around the world. Most change every 20 years or so. America is an exception. It hasn't changed basically in its fundamentals for centuries. So, of course, I can tell you how to get over some of these problems, but particularly in the current climate, you've got to get over the political problems before you can get to the legislative problems.
Thank you for that. And just still in what we saw in the election process, which threw up serious questions, there were quite a few points made by participants about the attempted disenfranchisement of minorities in some states. and that this clearly was picked up by lots of campaigners as being an outrage. And yet there was a sense in which in the past, it's something that's not been acted upon in anything like a robust way. Now, what's your reading of that element this time around?
So it's actually got worse, Hugh. I mean, it's not that things are bad, but that things have got worse because, of course, the Supreme Court annulled the control over some southern states with voting rights, which were instituted by Congress to make sure that standards were met. And increasingly, state legislatures have divided. So there is some good news. The Democratic state legislatures, like my own in Massachusetts, have really expanded convenient voting, absentee voting without excuse, as we call it, and making it really much easier for people to participate, which is important. Unfortunately, Republicans have gone the other way through voter ID requirements and so on. Some of those cases have been tossed by the courts, but nevertheless, it is a problem. The other bit of good news, though, of course, is that turnout went up, 67%. Now, that's not enormous by world standards, but it was a 7% increase, according to the Elections Project. And that, of course, was the overwhelming interest and enthusiasm and importance of this election. Party polarization mobilized both camps. Nobody expected that Trump would get such a high vote and a turnout on election day, and Democrats voted in advance through poster voting and things like that. So was there suppression? Yes, there were certainly many attempts at suppression, but in fact, overall, over the whole of America, more states have moved towards convenience voting. For example, all postal ballots in Oregon. And it's quite likely that given the experience we've had in the pandemic, some of those are going to stick because basically American voters want it, right? Even if they might not trust some of it, the process, they always have an alternative. But for those who want to vote by post, of course, they should be able to do so.
While we're on that, Pippa, while we're on the dynamics of participation, if you like, we noted, of course, with interest in the campaign and in the results, that in the Latino communities, Donald Trump, certainly in areas like Florida, did very well, and indeed in the African American communities in some areas too. Now, what were this actually was picked up as an element of surprise by lots of commentators. What were the main drivers there, do you think? What explains that pattern?
Well, I think we're still out a little bit on the evidence for this. Certainly Cuban American and those who were living around Miami-Dade clearly voted for Trump. And that was very much, they thought that Biden was a socialist. They kind of bought into that idea. And for that, their history and their culture meant they didn't approve of that. And Obama had liberalized some of the policies towards Cuba, which then Trump then refused to do. So there's particular factors there. In Florida, which was thought to be tight, the polls just got it totally wrong. Whether or not there was a general move, the exit polls, as you know, had problems with their projection. We've got two exit polls. VoteCast was one, Edison Research was the second, and they both produced some estimates of the demographics of the vote. And they tend to show that there was a small closure. For example, Black Americans, there was a kind of 3% swing towards Trump, but it was like from 90% to 87%. It's still basically the Black community is still solidly the base of the Democratic Party. And Hispanics are divided. About 67% in the exit polls, roughly 2/3 voted for Democrats and 1/3 voted for Republicans. And you can think of Hispanics as not really a group because they come from such different backgrounds. So from Venezuela, from Mexico, from Colombia, or from other parts of Latin America makes them very different in their background and values. And some of them are naturally voting for Biden because of partly DACA and illegal immigration and that whole business. Others, however, are much more conservative in their values. And so on things like abortion, they might vote for Trump and the Republicans. So they're not a monolithic group, which is good. But certainly there was some closure of the racial or ethnic gap, potentially, but we need to still look at the numbers once the votes have been certified and look at it at county level and then look at it at individual level once the American National Election Survey is available.
Thank you very much, Pippa. Again, just for those of you sending questions in, I'm not going through names, okay, because actually there are so many questions for which we are very grateful. I'm just trying to group all the questions in themes, and there are a lot of very, very good questions. On the next one, Pippa, I'm trying to conflate these questions, which are about really the future of the Republican Party, the future of the GOP. One person asking, look, can you tell us a little more about the rise in right-wing populist leadership style and policies and how that plays currently? And secondly, tell us a little more about your thoughts about the future of the GOP as a force, because let's face it, within it, there are many, well, or several factions at least, and several schools of political thought within it. And, you know, can it hold together if the rise in populist forces that you mentioned is going to go on and gather speed? Because if it does, surely that'll place strains on the unity of the Republican Party as we've known it.
So let me address that question about how parties change. And I think you can imagine it also in terms of how I think about Thatcherism and how Thatcherism ended and the Conservative Party reinvented itself to some extent in subsequent years. Parties I see a bit like ocean liners. They kind of go along and they have a particular set of values and norms and policies and leaders. And when they're faced with a big shock of defeat, then they tend to change tack. But it takes a lot of time. Sometimes you have to have 2 successive bad defeats in order to really change your position. Why? Because the people who are elected on the basis of the policies which they think worked. Moderates in the Republican Party tend either to have left because of Trump, or they were defeated in primaries, or they retired. And so increasingly, the composition of the GOP in the Senate and the House particularly has become more and more authoritarian. Think about those candidates, for example, who were elected in 2020 who believe in QAnon. QAnon is just nuts. QAnon is this conspiracy about pedophiles and Democrats and a world, etc., etc. Nobody with any rationality. And yet, mainstream within the GOP, some polls have suggested that a lot of people do support QAnon. So the party under Trump, but even before Trump, think about the Tea Party faction, was becoming more and more extreme because they appealed to the people who are going to support them in their funding, the people who are going to vote for them in their primaries, who are always the true believers, and they often have very strong majorities. And in the Senate, if they can get rural voters in the heartland of America to support them, the overrepresentation of the structure of the Senate means they can still get in. Something like 70% of the country is essentially underrepresented because if you think about the urban areas, which are primarily Democrat, and the coastal areas versus the rural areas which retain their power. So can the party change? Well, yes, it can if it was defeated badly under a couple of bad defeats, say 2022, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't a bad defeat. Remember that they said, well, we've made gains in the House. Nobody expected that. We've held on to the Senate in all likelihood. And of course, Trump still says, well, look, we got over 70 million votes. That's not bad, you know, with the tightness of the race, right? And of course, Trump might run again in 2024. I know that I hear collective groans probably by many of the people who are sitting in there looking at the Zoom screen, but it's entirely possible. So it hasn't yet happened that the Republican Party feels it needs to change. It hasn't had the incentives to change, and so it won't do so. And again, does it have moderates? Yes, it does. Susan Collins got re-elected from Maine against all the odds. Mitt Romney said, yes, Biden's the president. But, you know, there are a handful of people. And against that, Mitch McConnell in particular is only playing to his base. He got comfortably returned. He hasn't yet acknowledged Biden has won. And Kevin McCarthy, the leader in the House, has been equally obdurate, just saying, wait until the courts go through. I'm not going to offend Trump. I'm not going to offend my base, my voters. So they haven't yet been shocked enough to change. And I don't think they will in the short term.
Quite a few questions, Pippa, about the factors behind Trump's defeat, because there are lots of elements of the debate behind the campaign that he ran, etc. But lots of people asking the same question, which is basically, was it his handling, or mishandling as many people would say, was it his handling of COVID, the pandemic, that really was the driving factor here behind his defeat, or would you put your finger on some other things too?
So COVID in the exit poll, the Edison Research exit poll, done with a very large sample, asked people, how do you feel that the pandemic has been handled? And 80% or more of Republicans said it was going well under Trump and the task force. And of course, the opposite was there. Clearly about 90% of Democrats felt it was going well. So Is the COVID a major shock to the system? Absolutely. Has it affected different parts of the country and different political constituencies differently? Absolutely. Is it decimating now many of Trump's key areas, rural areas which haven't got good healthcare, and where the pandemic, which was thought of as a myth, is now causing havoc and deaths and overwhelming hospitals? Absolutely. The record is dreadful if you look at the rise in the recent period. Was it the decisive factor? I think it contributed, particularly through the other consequences it's had for the economy, for example, which has been very hit or miss across the whole country. Not the stock market, but the real economy where people are working. The lack of their congressional ability to pass a second CARES Act. They passed their first one in March. They did nothing throughout the long-term crisis during summer and in the fall. And then I think enough Democrats were mobilized positively by other issues, race and racial justice, and the big outpouring of the Black Lives Matter movement, which mobilized everybody, and other challenges which have just accumulated over the years under the Trump administration. So if you look at the polls throughout the Trump administration, basically they've always been about 40% of the electorate has said, I approve of the job he's doing. And it doesn't change that much. It goes a little bit down when he didn't get tax cuts through. It went up after he did get tax cuts through. And then it kind of plodded along with a little bit of natural, trendless fluctuation, as Anthony Heath used to say. But in the election itself, if you look at the campaign polls, if we can believe them, he was still around that base, and all he appealed to is his base. So if you don't expand to the moderate middle, then you're never going to get that tipping point to get over 51% of the popular vote, and then enough of the Electoral College in the swing states to get you through. So it was a small shift in the electorate, but a decisive shift. Many factors were part of that, and COVID was part of the background. Was it decisive? We'll have to wait until we get more reliable evidence beyond the exit polls, I think.
Okay, let's talk about something else that can be very decisive, which is the way that social media feeds the campaign, covers the campaign, and shares information about campaigns. The big tech firms, of course, there's been a lot of focus on how they police their own platforms, how they filter content, if they do, on their own platforms. You referred there to the rather polite notes that Twitter now puts on, but of course it's much wider than that. So what would you say to everyone online about the prospects for changes in this area, in the way that big tech, I suppose, handles election campaigns themselves, because that, after all, is the sharp end of the democratic process, and that's where all the sensitivity is.
And we know that that's a universal problem. It's in Britain as well, in terms of misinformation and disinformation. We always thought of it in terms of foreign interference through bots. The security services are pretty good. They have tightened all of that up. And so certainly the Russian threats and the Iranian threats and the Chinese threats, they argue, were actually caught because they had much better security protocols. They work with states. But the domestic stuff has just gone out of hand totally. And I wrote a paper on basically America was always about conspiracies. It's always had a kind of a natural constituency for that, partly because of its religious background, I think. So was 9/11 the product of the government? A large number of people believe that there was some sort of belief in that. The George Soros, the Pizzagate. So the conspiracies that were propounded by Trump and his allies through Twitter and Facebook built on that, but they were then spread throughout all of those who believe it. So it's very difficult, I think, for those who are in charge of the social media platforms to do that much about this. They can try to monitor. And so Twitter has put on these labels. Facebook has had all sorts of fact checks and employed thousands of people to try to do that. But of course, what you get is other outlets. Fox News, Trump has now said, oh, don't believe Fox News, because even though they were my ally, you should now watch one American network. And Parler has come along as an alternative to Twitter, and it doesn't moderate. So in a free market of ideas, even though we have the wonderful authority of the BBC and New York Times, Washington Post, by the way, the media, what we term the mainstream media, did a great job in the election. I mean, I think it was outstanding. The detail, the fact checking, the investigative reporting, first class. The networks were great, although they did have some problems on election night. But you can't, in a free press, when you believe in freedom of the press, control it easily through regulation, particularly with the Constitution in America. So it's a dilemma which we haven't regulated.
Well, I'm glad you got some BBC notes in at the end, Pippa. That's very kind of you. Although I'm sure some people online will be disagreeing, but you're absolutely right, of course. The way ahead is rigorous fact-checking all the way. And to demonstrate how you're doing that, and to do so repeatedly so that people get used to the fact that this is what you're doing. And that's the way to claw back maybe some of the loss of credibility that there's been in recent years. I have to say, Pippa, I've got loads of other questions, but I think our time's up. That was genuinely fascinating. You covered a lot of ground for us, and you fielded a range of questions, and did so in your usual sure-footed way and entertaining way as well, which is a great mix. So can I thank you personally? It's great to have you with us, it's nice to have you with us. We'll watch what's going on with interest, obviously, in the weeks ahead leading up to the end of January, because we didn't get onto some of the Biden implications for the UK, but we can do that again when we know exactly what's going on. But from me, Pippa, it's thank you. I'd like to thank everyone online as well for the excellent questions. And just to wrap up the session, I'm just going to hand over now to my good friend, Professor Roger Owen-Scully, who's going to just close the session for us. Roger, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and good evening, everyone. In reintroducing a Political Studies Association annual lecture, we at the PSA wanted to create an event that would not only be engaging and rewarding in its own right, but also showcase some of the best in political studies to demonstrate not only the sheer quality of much of the scholarship being conducted, but also its relevance in addressing some of the most pressing and profound problems that the world faces today. It is, I think, almost belaboring the obvious to state that these aims have been fully realized tonight. What Pippa Norris has said to us has not always made for easy or pleasant listening. There is a clear and present danger to the proper functioning of democratic politics in the world's most powerful country. And although the immediate danger may pass in January, there remains a much wider constituency of support, both in the United States and elsewhere, for the sort of politics that has brought us to this point. All of us here tonight will want, and I think will need, to reflect on their own responses to this situation. Before closing, I'd like to offer several sets of thanks. To the sponsors of tonight's event and the PSA's longtime partners, our friends at SAGE. As ever, it's been a pleasure working with you. To the PSA team, who have done a huge amount to put in place tonight's event and have been working behind the scenes to make sure it has run smoothly. Thank you very much. To our chair for tonight, Hugh Edwards, on what is not exactly a slow news day in the UK, we are very grateful that Hugh has set aside a considerable chunk of his time to lead tonight's event and to do so with his customary aplomb. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Hugh. I would also like to thank you, our audience, for being part of the event tonight. I very much hope that by this time next year, we can all meet together in one place. For now, wherever you are, thanks for your attendance and your participation through the questions submitted. And if you're joining us for the first time, the political studies community is certainly not full up, and there is most definitely a place for you, whether through our public membership, our schools membership, or our different membership offers to undergraduate students, early career scholars, and others. We hope you can continue to be part of this community for many years. Most of all though, and here I am sure I'm speaking on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank tonight's lecturer, Professor Pippa Norris. 3 years ago, the PSA was proud to award Pippa a very much deserved Lifetime Achievement Award. And tonight you've been given just a small glimpse of why we did that. Pippa's work continues to be a model of intellectually rigorous and politically engaged scholarship. So thank you very much, Pippa, and good night to you all.